Thank you for joining us for Maps of Experience, a celebration of diversity through language and landscape. I'm Megan Wilbar, Museum Coordinator for the InfoZone Museum at the Rollins Library. We are fortunate to have Rebecca Wood presenting for us this evening. Rebecca is a linguistic anthropologist whose research focuses on understanding and contributing to community language revitalization efforts in Native North America. Her work also focuses on ways language embodies important sociocultural information, including insight and solutions to social inequalities. Thank you, Rebecca, and I'll turn the screen over to you now.
All right, thank you. Ches chachal pesia, Rebecca Lewis Quest. So greetings, everyone. My name is Rebecca Wood, and I'm going to talk to you today about Maps of Experience. And I want to take you through really a celebration of diversity, especially when we talk about Native North America. There's so much diversity, and it really is a cause for celebration, especially for in this month and throughout the year. So not just focused on November, but throughout the entire year. And we're going to look at this diversity in terms of language specifically and the role it has with landscape. So if we look at Turtle Island, which is often referenced in the United States and Native North America, we see that we can classify these different populations and Native American cultures in a myriad of ways. One of that is through their cultural groupings. So, for instance, we can look at where we are located here in Colorado. That is a bit in the Great Basin region as well as the Great Plains. But that grouping alone isn't sufficient for us because we know that there's a lot of variation even within those particular cultural areas. There are 574 federally recognized tribes across the United States alone. And that, of course, does not include all those tribes that have not been recognized federally. Additionally, we know that these cultural groupings, or even just being part of a federally recognized tribe, does not get it to the heart of the diversity that exists also. Because if we look at the many reservations throughout the United States, we see that lots of populations interact with one another and are actually have all these different identities in terms of belonging to multiple different groups and populations. If we look at the languages, we see that in North America alone, pre-contact, there were over 500 different languages and as many as 750 distinct languages spoken. And unfortunately, due to colonization and our past histories, that many of those languages have been lost. And currently in the United States, there are 219 languages spoken. And of those 219, 194 of those are indigenous languages. Right, and so here is another grouping. This previous map here, this shows the different language families that exist or that have been identified throughout Native North America. So there is a huge amount of variability. This map, however, also doesn't demonstrate those cultural groupings or languages that are called language isolates. And these are languages that cannot be traced back to any population that we know of as of yet. So again, huge amounts of diversity. So this is just a bit of another way of looking at the similar map, but it's actually imposing it onto the different reservations that we see. And so I want to, again, really highlight with this diversity of languages and cultures that within, this happens globally because 2/3 to 3/4 of the world's population is either bilingual or multilingual. And so by saying that you are part of one language family doesn't really capture what an individual might possess in terms of the multiple identities and abilities to speak multiple languages, right? So of these, I mentioned 194 different languages. About 86% of those are what we reference as moribund, or another way to say it is that the language is not being passed on to the younger generations. And that, again, is a huge part due to different policies that the United States and Canada have had in the past and continue to do as well. Right. So with that, talking about these diverse languages, diverse cultures, it's really useful to start to examine this diversity in terms of the language assemblages. And what these assemblages do is it really avoids that notion that an individual is part of one single entity or one single group, and that they are a singular, fixed, and bounded connotation of what a community looks like, right? Because again, we're all each very unique individuals, but we're part of many different communities. And we see these different assemblages or groupings can have many different patterns of intentional coordination and unintentional, right? So contamination, collaboration, depends how you look at it. And so with these kind of different diverse groupings, we see that we can follow different communities of interaction and realize that we are, many of us, quite multilingual, and especially if we're highlighting Native cultural and Native individuals, right? And when it comes to diversity, this is very beneficial as a general society. We see that ecological diversity strengthens the ability to expand and to grow as communities. And so by looking at languages specifically, we can see that languages like species are highly adaptive to their environments and create these kind of ecological niches. And so by starting to examine what encompasses an assemblage, we can start to build up and again further appreciate how much diversity that exists. Now, if we're going to connect this diversity and the language assemblages to the landscape, we see that this is, again, another very beneficial tool. One thing I'm going to mention and talk about when I reference language and storytelling is something called traditional ecological knowledge. And when it comes to TEK, this is a complex set of knowledge practices and beliefs about the relationship that Indigenous peoples have with the living and non-living world around them, right? And so this traditional ecological knowledge is done very much so through participation with the landscape and the world around us. And so this was developed over hundreds, if not thousands of years for many of these communities. And so when we remove many of these tribal populations to, say, reservations and remove them from the land that they have lived on or had lived on for many generations, we see that that has very lasting and devastating effects. But we also see that this traditional ecological knowledge continues to be passed down through the language systems, which we'll get to in a moment. So what does that have to do with language further and the landscape? Well, we see that when we interact with the landscape, we do this through the language. And we actually have, each of us have a very specific way of experiencing and embodying our interactions with the landscape or just broadly the world around us. And this is a lovely quote by Keith Basso. And he explains, the shapes and colors and contours of the land, together with the shifting sounds and cadences of native discourse, thrust themselves upon the newcomer with a force so vivid and direct as to be virtually inescapable. Right? And so again, when we are in the landscape and we're interacting with it, and especially if we're talking about native culture, we really come to appreciate the importance that that landscape has in shaping our experiences and being shaped by them. Right. So again, further connecting the landscape to language, we can start with some kind of basic questions. So how are landscape features selected as nameable objects, for instance? How are landscapes interpreted as ontological categorizations, right? Why do we decide to name particular things or interact with them in a very specific way? And then how does language reflect these worldview perspectives? Because again, when I talk about all these different languages and different cultures that exist, even here in the United States, we see that these really do impact how we think about the world around us, and that transfers into our everyday lives. And we also want to look at what we can learn from viewing these things as interrelated and cross-linguistic and cross-cultural, because you might have some traditional ecological knowledge in language X, but that can also translate to language Y, and we have a lot to learn from one another. And again, that's why these assemblages are really important to look as things that are very much interacting with one another, because again, we're not confined to these solitary boxes that we often like to pigeonhole people and things into. We're very diverse in how we interact and move throughout our daily lives. Right? So, as with language, the landscape can't be understood in isolation. Again, coming back to those assemblages. So, if we think about things from, say, an archaeological understanding, it's really important not to just understand one particular excavation site for what you uncover, but how that site pertains to all the different types of landscape or different archaeological excavation sites that make up one whole landscape. So if we find something here in, say, Colorado Springs or Pueblo, it's really important to think about how those two sites might interact with one another, right? And this also gets into the different social constructs that we have with regard to place. So things like place names, right? Toponyms. Why do we call the mountain Pikes Peak and all the history that surrounds it versus, say, utilizing the Ute name Tava, right? What is associated with that particular name and how does it give it meaning? What are the different plants that we have in our environment, or the animals, or even the cultural groupings that we see? Right? So just to kind of think about this, when you see this image, you conjure up particular notions, right? This has very symbolic relationships and interpretations, right? This image, of course, is of Mount Rushmore, right? However, if you look at this same exact site from a different perspective prior to the actual desecration of a sacred site known by some populations as the Six Grandfathers, you're going to have a very different perspective of that landscape, right? Because again, if you're going to visit the Mount Rushmore as a tourist, you have certain ideas and notions about what you're going to visit, versus if you are, say, Lakota or Dakota, then you are going to have a different interaction with the Six Grandfathers. Similarly, here in Colorado Springs, we have this lovely place called Garden of the Gods. And again, if you interact with this space and on, say, a Saturday afternoon, you are going to get a very different experience than if you, say, go very early mornings on a weekday. But also this place conjures up different connotations if you are, say, part of the Ute, who are indigenous to this land and utilize this space for very important sacred and celebration events. Right? Again, thinking about how we connect to the landscape and we talk about these places is really important. So when we talk about the landscape and through language, I like to look at these things through the notion of storytelling, because storytelling is a really useful way and really a key mechanism for the socialization of both cultural and moral development of individuals. Right. We see that through the process of storytelling, you're engaging multiple perspectives, right? You are passing on, as it mentions, moral development to individuals. It creates a situation where you are taught valuable lessons when it comes to, say, interacting with the landscape. It teaches you how to respect the world around you, whether you're talking about the plants, the animals, the little insects or the crawlies, the fish, the birds. You're showing this respect, and you learn that through this process of storytelling. You also learn the process of reciprocity. Right? So this notion that you can't just take something, you're always wanting to give back, right? Because it is about that respect, right? It's teaching you about having relationships. So again, relationships with the land, but also relationships with one another. Because as you are interacting in that space of storytelling, you are developing a relationship with your peers around you, the speaker who's telling the story, the different listeners, because that itself becomes a shared experience. And it really does become a conversation with the world around us. So if we see and go back to that notion of different perspectives and diverse voices, we see that if we're willing to listen in the landscape and hear the stories told to us, whether it is through an individual elder speaker, or maybe it's through the different animals around us trying to tell us something. Is it the right time of year to harvest something? Or maybe we need to wait. Right? This also provides a really important cultural resource for negotiating multiple perspectives and experiences. Because we know when we listen to a story being told that there are many different ways in which we can hear that same particular story. Perhaps we're in a bad mood and we don't really want to truly listen to the story that's being told to us. Or maybe we're open, or we have a very open heart and we're willing to accept that. Also, we know that individuals tell stories very differently. And that is the beauty of the language, in that it gives us a wide repertoire of ways to communicate with one another, right? The storytelling language and landscape provides an opportunity to create community, to heal community, because you're sharing your stories and experiences that you've had in the past and continue to renegotiate through as you know you move throughout your life. Right? This is also a way to normalize language and interactions with our landscape, or even just language out in our everyday lives. And it's a way to reclaim the space that was often removed from many of these indigenous populations. So when it comes to storytelling, landscape, traditional ecological knowledge, I want to give you some perspectives from a particular population that I have the opportunity to work with and collaborate with. And this population is the Salish Kalispé, and often referred to as the Salish Pondere in the English language. And so this cultural group is located in western Montana on the Flathead Indian Reservation. This reservation is immensely beautiful. We have the lovely Glacier National Park very nearby, Flathead Lake. Has about over 1.3 million acres. And the reservation was established in 1855 by the Hellgate Treaty. So I focus on the Salish Kalispé because I've been working with this community for about 15 years. And it's really important for this tribal population to revitalize their language and culture. So I've mentioned that, we have in the United States a not very rosy picture of our historical treatment towards indigenous populations, as well as other populations. But what we have done very well in this country is eradicating those languages, right? So the Salish language would be considered highly endangered. And so of a roughly 6,500 individuals that are tribally enrolled members, there are now, unfortunately, fewer than 10 fluent speakers remaining of the language. And so there have been mass efforts starting in the 1970s to try to revitalize this language, meaning that they're trying to breathe new life and really reestablish and reclaim the language, and along with it, their culture, so that it becomes normalized in the everyday to hear the language spoken. So part of these efforts, there's a vast amount of work that's been done. Like I mentioned, starting in the 1970s, anything from immersion camps in the summertime to bring children to learn about the language and culture. There's horse camps, again, held in the summer, hunting camps during the fall time in the appropriate months, where families gather together to just try to stay in the language and learn about the culture through that hunting process. There's also a Salish in school. It's called Inclusum, in which is immersion school for pre-K to 8th grade. There are apps that you can learn the language. There are Salish language educator development programs in which individual college students can enroll at the tribal college and receive an education to become a teacher, as well as you are on a dual track to be in this language immersion program, and so that you can become or directly placed into the school system to be a language teacher yourself. But we see that there is much still to be done when it comes to these different language revitalization efforts. And really, this has to do, again, with those diversity of perspectives and diversity of voices. And so it's really valuable to start looking at ways to branch out and have a lot of these voices heard, and really create a lot of different curriculum that can benefit multiple different individuals and groups across the reservation. So on the reservation alone, the Salish Kalispé are actually the minority population. So they are roughly make up about 28% of the total population. So again, you have a lot of voices that you need to attune yourself to and kind of deal with when we're talking about revitalization. So it's not just about revitalizing the language alone. You also need to think about all the social injustices and inequities that really do exist. And so part of the project that I have the opportunity to work with is expanding those voices for the revitalization efforts. And so collaborating with the tribe, we have gone about this through storytelling. And again, finding ways to not only revitalize the language, but revitalize the culture as well, and bring back some of those key components of the culture, which includes things like food sovereignty and just awareness of those traditional ecological knowledge. So in collaboration, we decided that it would be great to start documenting what are called Smeet Meet narratives, rather than, say, Skolumpt narratives, to create a more detailed and nuanced understanding of the language, culture, and individual creativity. Now, we separate those two types of narratives as an important component because Smeet Meet narratives are more what we would consider news or stories, as opposed to the Skolumpt, which are traditional coyote stories. And those traditional stories are meant for a very specific time of year and aren't necessarily meant for everyone, right? And so this kind of gets away from the culturally sensitive areas, so that we can create pedagogical materials from these different stories. We do also, because elders like to share the stories, we do have a time and space for Skolumpt or coyote stories, but those aren't really for everyone, right? And so, and I say that we need to create a more detailed and nuanced understanding of the language. So what has happened is we have collected over the years many different stories, but often this is done through direct elicitation, meaning that we gather information from, say, how do you say apple? How do you say, the cat ran after the mouse? By allowing individuals to tell their own stories, we are creating a lot more fluidity and understanding of the language in terms of the different nuances that speakers have when it comes to how they talk. And so we try to create a sense of diversity even within these stories. So many voices are told or recorded from different ages to genders, to backgrounds, because even within the few speakers that are remaining, they have different ways of talking or different dialects. And so we want to try to include as much of that as we can so that when learners are trying to reclaim the language, they have a larger kind of source to pull from. So we start to see through these different storytelling instances or narratives that there are a lot of ways in which Salish cultural beliefs, morals, and practices are conveyed and transformed through that process. And so not only are you creating or documenting these stories, but you're creating different ways to teach individuals about the landscape, about different morals, and really just ways of being in the culture. Through this process, we also create a sense of community and connection to place, because what has been lost a lot of times is, again, that connection to space and place. So children aren't being taught about the world around them. So it's really important in these different processes and documentation efforts to bring that to the front, right? So things like the cycles. Why are cycles done in the number 4? 4 is a really important number for the Salish. Humor. Humor also critically important. And sometimes that gets lost in when you do these kind of typical elicitation techniques. So with the storytelling, it also becomes a form of reciprocity and histories in the making. So again, it's trying to find ways to connect people with the landscape around them. And that's really important because tribal members continue to describe the landscape as having medicinal value. So we can find healing in the world around us, but also healing through creating these communities and creating stories together. And as we've been documenting these stories and creating pedagogical or teaching materials for students, we find that it happens very commonly where you're laughing and crying and sharing your own stories as you're learning from the elders together. Right? And really, storytelling has been a long and important site for the transmission of traditional cultural and moral values. It's said that for the Salish and many other Native groups, that there are specific times and places for storytelling to happen, especially if we're talking about coyote stories. And so those are typically done in the winter months when there's snow on the ground, because that's a time when you are kind of huddled together and sharing while it's very cold outside. Right? And so by analyzing and sharing these narratives of traditional stories, we can again start to find that healing and cultural value that connects people with the landscape. So to give you just a quick snapshot of some of the what we found in our stories, and I'm only going to share very minimally with you because again, even though these stories are SMEAT-Me or news stories, they're also not meant for the larger, broader population. Maybe at some point, but currently they are not. So this is one particular area of the traditional Salish landscape. This is not part of the reservation here, but we can see that these are a bunch of place names in the traditional sacred lands, and each place has a very specific name, right? So for instance, Kala or Kalsa, that has Camus. Right. So with that particular name, it indicates not only the place and its description of that place, but there's also special stories that go with each one of these places so that individuals can start to learn about these places and the historical events that happened there and how individuals can kind of start to reconnect with this landscape. So for instance, this is one of the stories that we have kind of translated into the Salish language. This isn't one of the direct narratives. We've kind of worked the opposite way. We've had an English narrative and we've translated it to Salish. And this is again done by we have different elders do this. And this is a story about the mache, or the glacier lily. and it describes for students, it introduces a wealth of language material for them, but it also introduces an awareness of where to find this particular plant. It creates an awareness of how to use it for different purposes, be it medicinal, for food, or whatever it may be. And so hopefully this works. Nope. Okay, let me try this really quickly.
Kutinaksam siitl lumache kolul kalispeli. Es ilist lumache soheps ikal kal was ilist. Tas elkustum luchelne te etchen. Il skept was diuchts ne put zet ekom equal qualil.
All right, so that's just one example of how we're trying to incorporate some of these stories with the landscape and with students to, again, kind of relearn some of this traditional ecological knowledge through the process of storytelling. So again, it's not just about recording these stories, but it's also a really useful tool for, again, revitalizing the language, because we are creating situations to bring the stories out into the landscape and into the community where they normalize things. So the image on the left is an elder woman. She is cleaning a plant. It's speculum. It's a really important plant called or bitterroot for the Salish. And again, there's a sacred story that goes with this. The middle picture is an instance of stichlum, or a canoe. This is the first time, it occurred about two or 3 years ago. So it was the first time that a traditional built canoe had entered into the Salish or the Flathead Lake for over 50 years. So again, you're creating these environments. And the last image is of Chicaya. That's where the ram's head got stuck. And again, this is, we call this the medicine tree. And there's biannual kind of trips down to this tree. And it's, again, a sacred tree. And we congregate and tell stories and share and ask for healing at this site. So again, it's a way to normalize the stories that we're teaching and documenting into the everyday normal society. All right. So what I hope I've shown in some ways throughout this talk is that through these different mapping of experiences, we can celebrate diversity, right? Because we each have our own different way of knowing and experiencing the landscape around us. And if we start to understand and appreciate some of these different cultural ways of doing so, we can really start to learn from one another, right? It's really important to listen to multiple voices to ensure that there is this continued complex array of symbolic relationships with the physical surroundings, and that is maintained and renewed. Because if we start to listen to, again, these elders and native cultures and voices when it comes to the landscape, we can start to learn about sustainable ways of living, about food sovereignty, and really encourage these individuals to create that space and reclaim that space. And really, it is just a celebration of these different voices, and we can really learn from one another from those communities that surround us, and really further enhance our assemblages or ways to interact and be productive with one another. So thank you for listening, and Lam Lam Specia.